Okay, so I would like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Elif Ryder from Kroll. Elif is an associate director in Kroll's investigations and disputes practices, where she specializes in using data analytics to detect fraud, waste, and abuse. She works primarily in the areas of regulatory compliance, data quality assessments, anti-bribery and corruption, and corporate investigations, and she has taught and written on these topics. So she's a terrific person to guide us through this panel, where hopefully we'll learn something about what folks in your field are doing in data analytics. It's, of course, a field somewhat in its infancy, but I think we all know it's kind of the way of the future, so I'm anxious to hear about where we're headed and what we can expect. Elif, you want to take over here?
Hello, so thanks for the introduction. So I have been in the data analytics field for a decade now, and I have worked over the years with private and public institutions, nonprofit and private agencies, and I have seen a lot of things, and we now even see it in our personal lives. We live in an age where we have an abundance of data all around us, and one area that has been lacking in the use of innovative data analytics is the public space. We know that marketers and retail companies use data analytics to a great extent to try to control our decision-making processes, but we don't use analytics enough for philanthropic purposes and for the greater good. So here we have a select group of individuals who are actually using data analytics to make life better for the public, and so I think this is a very important time to be talking about this. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our panelists, and then each of them are going to present a 15 minutes presentation on their work using data analytics to fight corruption in the public domain. And then we are going to start with a few questions, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So we have Bruno Bondarovsky. He's the Secretary of Planning from the city of Mesquita, Rio de Janeiro, and he has been an advocate of enabling data analytics environments in the public processes and procedures in his office. He has been running an overhaul of converting processes and procedures to electronic and innovative methodologies, and he's also running a dashboard project, which I'm sure he'll tell us about. We have Milton Yu, who is the Inspector General of the New York Department of Investigation. So he oversees the Children's Services, Department of Homeless Services, Division of Youth, Family Justice, along with a couple other agencies. He's also a great advocate for using data analytics to keep governments corruption-free. And of course, we have Jennifer Rodgers, who is the Executive Director of Center for Advancement of Public Integrity. She has a background as an assistant U.S. attorney at the Southern District here in New York City, and she's also a lecturer at Columbia Law, and she recently worked on a publication called Taking a Bite Out of Corruption, which I recommend all of you, if you haven't done so already, to take a look at, which talks about specific data analytics methodologies and what to look for, the pitfalls to avoid for using data to run better analytics in the public domain. So from here on, we can move on to the presentations. Jennifer, do you want to start with yours?
Do a little shuffling around, I guess. Okay, hi everyone. So here I am again. I promise you I will not participate in every single aspect of this conference. But I did need to take this opportunity to share with all of you the work that we've been doing on data analytics and the framework report that we've recently published, because I hope it will be interesting to all of you who are looking to start doing some of this work as you go about your anti-corruption work. So we published our framework a couple of months ago. It can be found on our website. It looks like this. It's nice and hefty. It's 60-some pages, so we didn't print out copies for people, but you can download it at any time. So what we were trying to do with this project is, I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but you can't be someone who is looking to instill good government at any level, local, state, or federal, and not know that data analytics is the wave of the future, right? And it's being used already in so many impressive ways in government, in policing, for example, in service delivery. There are lots of terrific things going on with data. But corruption has been one area where it's been really hard to start doing this. And I think that's for a few reasons. It's hard to know what corruption is going to look like, where to find it. You need to really be looking across agencies, and it's so many different data sets. It's not like you're just looking for crime control things so you can kind of keep within the data in your police department. You really have to be looking more broadly. And so for some of those reasons, corruption control has been a little bit behind in the move towards data analytics. So we tried to see, with the help of a foundation grant that we received, we put together this project to see whether we could shed some light on what the problems were, what some of the difficulties were, and put together a framework for cities who could take it and start to do some of this work to figure out how they needed to start collecting and treating their data to get it in shape, and then the areas within city government where you would want to look for the kind of fraud and corruption that you wanted to uncover. And of course, it's not, even once data analytics is up and running, it's not as if you push a button and, out pops 3 names and you just walk into the grand jury, right? All we're really talking about is trying to find a more efficient way to narrow down to groups of people or areas that are more efficient to target than the traditional methods of using kind of random spot checks or relying on complaints from either whistleblowers or the general public. So what we did is we formed a working group of experts, and let's see if let's see what we have here. Someone's coming to fix my PowerPoint. I'm going to show you the working group of experts that we put together. We tried to form a wide variety of folks. We took people from government, both people who are on the anti-corruption side, like, there we are. Okay, so on the left is our working group. We tried to pick folks from government, kind of investigators and prosecutors whose jobs it is to fight corruption. We wanted to have policymakers as well. We added data scientists, people from good government groups and other civil society, so that we were looking for kind of a wide swath of people. Both Milton and Calvin Lam next to him, also from DOI, participated in our working group. And the idea was to get enough brain power around the table to really figure out, what we wanted to do, where the problems were, where we wanted to look for some solutions to help us put together this framework. So we got everyone together. We met 4 times over the course of about a year. And one of the first things we realized after kind of having our big whiteboard session and brainstorming what we wanted to do and some of the questions that we wanted to be able to answer was that we needed even more information. We needed an even deeper dive. So on the right of this slide, you'll see a list of 40-some folks who we interviewed also as part of this project so that we could learn even more about where we wanted to look in cities for where these risks might be, the data that might be available to try to find the fraud that we were looking for, and how we ought to put this all together in our framework. So, so our report as it stands, we tried to do a few things. This is Appendix A in our report. It just describes kind of the questions that we decided we wanted to answer. But we tried to do a few things. We wanted to frame the problem, right? The problem of how you can use data analytics, why you wanted to use data analytics. It provides some history of the very few kind of corruption-related uses that are in existence now that we could find. Also has some similar uses of data analytics in other fields like I described, just to give you a little bit of background. It described the substantive work that the working group did in identifying these areas of city government where we felt it was most fruitful to focus in the early stages, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Our report provides best practices for data management issues. There's a big section on that. It gives some cautions and considerations, things to think about as you embark on this exciting data analytics journey, things like privacy concerns and the like. And it provided some possible next steps for those folks who are really interested in this and ambitious about it, some projects that you could potentially take on to try to get this going. So the two key parts really are the identification of the high-risk areas and the data management suggestions. So focusing on these areas that we found that are kind of the place to start, we ended up with, I don't know, it might be between 20 and 25 suggestions in a bunch of different categories of places to begin. And we tried to pick the simplest ones where there is readily available data and you can kind of pick some of the easiest things to do that they might seem very obvious, and I think they are. And they're the things that were kind of at the top of our whiteboard as we were discussing all of this. But I think you do want to start somewhere fairly simple because it's complicated enough to do the data management you need to do and get that all in shape and then come up with your algorithms and start doing these searches. And so, you don't need super, super complex queries, at least at the outset. So here's what we distilled this into as we finished up our report and got it into kind of publication shape. We distilled it down to our top 10 approaches to taking a bite out of corruption. So the report, of course, goes through all of the 20 some odd suggestions that we made, and we describe why it is we think it's a good place to start, what data you should be looking for, and kind of what you should do with the results. But then here, we did go to the top 10 just to have kind of a more bite-sized, number of things to talk about. And I'm just going to go through these, if I can read them. It's very small. Yeah, it's very small up there, too. I think we all just have to download the report and go from there. But so number 1 and number 2 are both in the categories of fraud by inspectors, which is one of the most obvious things you think of, right, when you think about where your fraud risks might lie. Here's a category of city employee that has discretion, where there's big money involved. If you're talking about, for example, building inspectors, fire inspectors, there's a lot of money in not getting shut down, so there's a potential for bribes there. So we focused in on that and wanted to take a look at a very simple thing, a simple outlier analysis for inspectors writing the most and the least reported code violations, right? And it's obvious, the least because, hey, maybe those guys are taking bribes, right, not to be writing these tickets. And the most is interesting, too, both because it just might show you something. It might not lead to necessarily a person who ultimately is doing something wrong, but shows you kind of a study in contrast about what these different inspectors are doing. So I would want to see who's writing the most violations as well. And then the second category was searching for code violations that had been changed or downgraded after they were initially logged. So again, for obvious reasons, you have a violation and then all of a sudden you don't, or you have a downgrade, why did that happen? And the issue with fraud by inspectors, depending on your city and how it keeps its inspection records, is the data, right? So if you're in a place where it's electronically kept and you can easily kind of gather that information and search it, then you're in great shape. If you're in a place where inspection violations are still kind of written on some sort of receipt thing and then later transformed into, the computer by someone else, then you're in a little bit of a different space. So, with all of this, it depends on the data, but most cities are moving towards electronic inspection records, and so that's a good thing for this. The next is Human resources-related fraud by public employees. We had 2 of those in our top 10. Again, just an outlier analysis identifying overtime, the most overtime. I mean, it sounds so simple, but cities lose a lot of money through fraud in overtime. And then suspiciously consistent overtime claims, same day of the week, same number of hours. I mean, these are all so obvious, but if you just could run a simple query, you'd find some fraud pretty quickly, probably. And here you're looking at timekeeping data, which the good news is that most cities are now electronically up to speed with timekeeping data, or soon will be if they're not already. We then chose benefits fraud, a couple of things in the benefits fraud category. We thought about, and I think Milton and Calvin may be talking about this stuff a little bit, but searching for transactions outside the zip code of the beneficiary's reported residence. And here we're talking not about beneficiaries who are committing fraud. I mean, that's another problem, of course, for cities. But when you're talking about an anti-corruption agency, we were focused more on the city employees who might be helping with that fraud or setting up some sort of fake beneficiary or something. So that's really what we're looking for with this sort of thing. And then, again, an outlier analysis identifying employees who issue emergency benefits at a particularly high rate. Emergency benefits, at least here in New York, are issued without the same checks and approvals that regular benefits are, for obvious reasons. If it's an emergency, you need the money quickly, and you can't wait for all of the checks and it going to the different agencies for the layers of approvals. And that being the case, it's more likely to there's more likely to be higher rates of fraud there. We had a couple of thoughts about campaign finance violations and theft of public funds. If your city has a matching program and or campaign limits, then you likely have publicly available donation data. So you can mine that data if it's in the right format, hopefully, to do some of these simple searches to try to find where there might be straw donors or other situations where the donations are actually not legitimate. And if you're able to cross-reference that information with vendor data and lobbyist data, then even better. You might be able to find some good things there. So number 8, we did petty theft of resources and inventory. This was a tough one because, as I understand it, at least here in the U.S., the major cities don't seem to yet have their act quite together on inventory records. That's a really big problem in cities. Cities buy a lot of things. A lot of those things are valuable and can be stolen and sold on a resale market fairly easily. And centralizing the information about where inventory is and who's in charge of it and what it's worth is a big challenge. I think this is one area where cities can learn from the private sector about how to keep tabs on their stuff. So hopefully cities are moving in the direction of doing that more effectively. But in the meantime, there's a lot of leakage here, a lot of loss, and so this is an area to focus on if the data is in shape. Then number 9 is procurement fraud. This was a tough one because if you're fully up to speed with an electronic procurement system and a good vendor management system, then there's a lot you can do in this area, and this is another big ticket area as far as potential fraud. But if you're not, it's much harder to do. So we suggested a quite simple thing, which is cartel screen software programs to help identify collusive bidding. And there's a lot of good work being done in this area. A lot of international groups like the World Bank do terrific work in this area. So there are a lot of models for that. And then number 10, we was fraudulent legal claims against the city. Cities pay out a lot of money to people in lawsuits, and so an attempt to try to minimize fraud in that area is to just take a look at some simple things. And what we suggested here was just to look at awards right under the cap to identify possibly fraudulent claims, right? If you know that at $10,000 is where they start to fight you and get into litigation and so on, then you make your claim for $9,800, and maybe the same lawyer does that a few times with different clients, and then you have a reason to be taking a closer look. So other categories of things that we looked at and made suggestions about that didn't make our top 10 list were vendor and contractor fraud and fraud and corruption by elected or high-level officials. So there's lots of other suggestions in the report, which I second Elif's suggestion to to take a look at it, please. And then we have a big section on data management, best practices. It has suggested resources in it. There's some manuals linked in there so that you can start to study this issue. It talks about data structuring, how to input data properly, creation of a data dictionary, data cleaning. And this stuff is not fun stuff. This is like the bad work that you have to do to get to run the fun searches, but it's necessary in order to be able to do it. And if you approach this in a thoughtful way, it will make it less painful, I think. So we tried to make some helpful suggestions there. We really want to improve our report, so if you do take a look at it and you have thoughts, please let us know. And we're also looking to partner with cities who are interested in doing some of this work. And so if you are a city employee and you're interested in working with us and trying to implement some of these solutions and ideas, please let me know, and we'd love to talk about that. So my time is up. We'll take questions, I think, at the end. So thank you all very much. Who's up next? Are you next?
I don't know.
Is he next? Okay, great.
That's okay.
I'll just switch places with you then. I'll be Bruno. That's good.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
That would be like. I'm having some trouble here with my presentation,
Someone's coming.
which is this one. Yeah, this
Oh, you
one.
got it?
Yeah, I guess so.
Do you want to use the,
Okay.
you got it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. Clicker there?
All right, thank you. So, first of all, well, I like to say that the city I work, Mesquita, is willing to work with you with all these initiatives that you just presented us.
Great.
And as I'm working now in Mesquita, and it's a small city around Rio, and before that I used to work at Rio de Janeiro, the capital of Rio State. And hearing Mark Pierce telling us about the problems here, I wish Rio has those problems. And I wish Mesquita has Rio's problems. So we are very different in terms of cultural barriers and knowledge in terms of what is it to fight corruption and what is it to take policies against corruption. So anytime we want to pass any law or decree that is towards integrity and against corruption, there's a lot of resistance. Normally, those public servants feel they are like on suspicion, and as the majority of them are honest, we could say so, they feel that they are being attacked. So we experienced a lot of resistance in every action. And it came to my mind to say this because as I spread the word that I would be here, telling you that lots of people were worried that they will be watching us and I'll be talking that they are corrupt just because we have integrity measures over their work. So it's a cultural difference, I guess, and I think it was important to mention to you. So I'm here to talk about the licensed business delivery in Rio de Janeiro. So we have a 4-step process to deliver licenses, which is first a consultation of the zoning, and then the entrepreneur has to register the company and then go to the license itself and then picking up the license. And in all these phases, these steps, there was a lot of face-to-face meeting. It was all on paper, and it went through different agencies. So there was a lot of opportunity for behavior deviation or other attitudes, as you may imagine. So the prior system, before our intervention, used to issue no more than 40,000 licenses a year, which was the usual number in Rio City from 2011 to 2014. And then we started a project that was already planned by Mayor Paes during his 2 terms That was to get it faster and get it online. So the first phase, the first element was to bring it from paper to digital, of course, because if you wanted to find out how many shops you have in a neighborhood, let's say Copacabana, many times you have to go into paper, digging and searching, and you can say that in 2011, 12, it's already very outdated. So we made an effort to building up system and also to make people use the systems, because in some of the steps we already had systems, but they were not used by most of the people. They kept using the paper system. After that, we went from, which was decided by people, by human, from automatic. So we tried to put the legislation into the system, so less consultations and less licensing will be decided by people. I'm talking about 200,000 consultations a year, and it was 40,000 licenses a year that passed through people's hands to say yes or no. And although there's a legislation, there is very fragile in terms of decision and control. And the third phase, which was very interesting also, is once we put that online and digital to get that with transparency and use that for business development and city development and to leave a legacy over there. So I'm going through all that. So as I told you, the old process was all paper-based. We have like 12 steps, can be more than that at the, and we have, it goes through 6 different agencies. It can be more than that. I'll show that right afterwards. And as I said, many face-to-face meetings. And each consultation goes through 2 people, an inspector and the director who would supervise and add information on that. So it was a really heavy process, as you may see, and with improvements. Also, we got a lot of workforce to do other tasks like enforcement, for example. And license took from 45 days to 3 months, could be a little less, could be a little more, but that was the usual time that it took. So the new process, as I told you, it's all online. It's a new streamlined workflow system. There's only actually 2 agencies involved. And what have we done with the other agencies? Well, the entrepreneur or its representative, he just fill out that he will comply to the rules as it's very common here in the US. And then the agency afterwards will enforce him and check if he's following wherever rules he has to follow. We have a very complex zoning system in Rio. So we made half of them automatic, and we are working on getting it to 80% now. So that will take, like, of the 200,000 consultation, a lot of consultation out of the path for those inspectors and those public servants. Also, since the process used to go from the municipal level to the state level to the federal level, so many times the entrepreneur has to provide the same information over time and in each agency. So what we have now, it's an integration between those entities, so he doesn't have to repeat that information, and we can protect the system from loss of integrity also. And it's all codified in new decrees, executive orders, so it's all legal, and we have a legacy for more than that. And some of the licenses, 2/3 of them now are issued the same day, just through the system, which is very good news. And from that, we made a study that we took more than $6 million that were lost in the process from the companies, like in time and not profit they were not doing because they were like doing paperwork. So we have a company that calculated that around $6 million on that savings. Also, the new process has a new transparency board. We produced it during the Data for Good Exchange event last year. It was very interesting because we have a data specialist from NYU, and he helped us, Christian helped us to get all this data from this new streamlined workflow system and put it in the Tableau system, which is a free platform. And we got impressed. It went on the news in Brazil. We got a lot of support. And the very good news is that now the City Hall took all that model and built his own data dashboard with more information, and it's not been launched yet. I have it here. I'll show you. But they are building this new dashboard, very powerful and very useful also, as I will show you right now. So some results. We have a faster and easier process, more user-friendly. We have more businesses. From year to year, we had like 74,000 licenses issued. So in 2014, it was 40,000 a year. So it's almost 80% improvement in businesses that were some way illegal, that now they have like a city license. That's amazing. That's big number. In terms of tax, there's a tax you pay when you got this license, and we have already noticed a 25% increase in this tax revenue just for this license. That will figure around $2 million a year. So that's already good news, good for Rio, good for society. As I told you about the money saved on this process. And of course, through this portal, you can have better city planning because you'll see which neighborhoods has which businesses, and including where the competitors are, where the clients are. So a lot of information that can be used. I separated the integrity results. So we have corruption vulnerabilities reduced since there's no more face-to-face meetings, things go all through the system. We have new opportunities for corruption identification. For example, consultation that get denied, and then there's an appeal, and we can compare between zones in the city, which places have more appeal and more approved appeals for revision, and maybe they'll allow us to track some corruption, or it will discourage people to do that once they know they will be exposed. So this is very interesting in terms of discourage misbehavior through transparency. And also we have a node zoning system in Rio, and in some places we can say that it's a bad zoning system. You can see very fancy areas with a lot of restaurants that restaurants are not allowed. So how can that happen? People are not, for example, if you know Rio, Leblon and Ipanema has fancy areas that restaurants are not allowed, and there are lots of restaurants there. So people are not closing these restaurants. They must change the law, the zoning system. And to do that, we got now evidences that they should hurry on that. So this is another interesting result. So now I'll just show you very quickly. I guess I have some time. So we'll open the browser here. This is the portal they are doing that has not launched yet, but you can see it here. So I have 40,037 licenses issued from June 2016 to June 2017, today actually. And it is separated between what is companies, individual companies, and liberals like lawyers and consultation. And we can check each month how it is. You can see that in September and August, due to the Olympic Games, we had a boost in the data, in the number of companies. Don't take into account the beginning and the end because the months are cut. But it's interesting also that you can find what are services, what is commerce, what is industry, and also this is the type of solicitation, if it is a new business or a change in an old business. And here you have the activity in both local classification and the national classification. So you can see we have training, you have organization of expositions, you have clothing, consultancy, promotion, bars, restaurants, representatives. So you can see what is happening in the local economy. And right here you have the neighborhoods. This is Rio. This is around 30 miles from one side to the other, 25 miles. And here you have Barra da Tijuca, which is the more active neighborhood now. And here you have downtown. And right here you have Copacabana and Botafogo, which are neighborhoods of the South Zone that are very active. And you can see us here also, Campo Grande. That's a neighborhood that's very active nowadays. So we can now check what is going on with the city, very important for city planning. This is the time of the answer for the license, as I told you, most of them at the first day, 2/3. And this is the area that has answered it, so we can compare the areas and check how they are performing in terms of every indicator we may want. I'm not going to details here, but what is very interesting here, this dashboard is all sensitive. So for example, if I just click here on Barra da Tijuca, it will rearrange itself so we can see how many licenses were, so from the top, in Barra da Tijuca, each month, like around 1,800, and mostly services, and mostly new activities, and mostly installation of antennas, which was for the Olympics for sure, and revision of filming, and it was also all the TVs that were there, like starting new companies to support the Olympics, so we can see this kind of thing. There's another dashboard. I'm not going into details onto it, but you can see the licenses that are ongoing. So through these licenses, we can see where it is stopped and check this department if there is any problem there, if it is a long time there. So there are some licenses at the fire department, some licenses are waiting for the entrepreneur to fill out his forms, and we can check what is going on in each department. And there's a last one here, which is about the previous consultation. I'm not sure I will be able to get it online, but it can tell you the previous consultations that has been denied. So in that way, we can check bad legislation and see into details what is going on. And these are all opportunities for corruption or bribery or any small power that can jump into the situation. So besides that, I have maybe 1 minute just to very quickly show you. I'm sorry about that. So this is the new portal. I'll not go into details on it, but this is the portal of the municipality, and yeah. So we can start the new license here, and through it, very easy to do the process, and it's like a wizard-like process. So my time has finished, and I guess I've been through everything. These are the decrees, this is the system, and this is the whole agencies that took part, the entire process that we have to deal with since the beginning, and really change their behavior on that. Next steps, to simplify zoning and establish some automating supervision. Thank you very much, and I'll hear for questions lately. It's amazing.
Where is the PowerPoint? PowerPoint slides. They're coming by. It's got it. Thank you. Stop screen. Yeah, it's all minimized as well. Outside the flash drive. That's it. Is it? No, that's not this. That's no. I don't see it over here. I have to find where the flash drive went.
It's ironic that we have technical difficulties in a discussion about data analytics. So while that's getting set up, again, my name is Milton Yu. I'm the Inspector General for a squad that oversees the social services agencies here in New York City. And with me today is Calvin Lam. He's the team lead of my data analytics team, and thank you. And really, what I think is the heart and soul of my squad's data analytics unit. And you know, I want to refer you again to Jennifer's paper because I think it's a really good paper and it touches on you know, a broad spectrum of topics concerning data analytics, and what Calvin and I hope to do in the next few minutes is really give you a perspective of how data analytics looks like from a practice standpoint, and specifically from a practice investigative standpoint here. So a few years ago, when we started on our path to develop a data analytics strategy for our squad at DOI, we started off by looking at what challenges our investigators had in the way they conduct their investigations. And we came up with 3 challenges. And then we flipped it on its head and said, well, you know what, these challenges and the answers to which will become the goals of our data analytics strategy. So the first challenge that our investigators have, and I think most of you who are practitioners of anti-corruption and anti-fraud have experienced, is obtaining that global view of the problem, you know, having a global view of the issues. I will tell you from my experience that you know, a simple complaint of, you know, $56 stolen from food stamp benefits is not all that it seems. In fact, we've had one case where that was the initial complaint, and through the use of analytics and further investigation, it turned out to be a several $1,000s scheme, fraud, which involved a human resources employee and her confederates. So obtaining that global view is really important, and one of the challenges that we face as investigators, and certainly one of the goals that we had set out in terms of developing a data analytics strategy. The second challenge that our investigators had was, of course, the speed in which we conduct our investigations. You know, we all have experienced different pressures, you know, some of which come from within, some of which are external. If we notice that, for example, fraud is being committed and thousands of dollars and millions of dollars of city funds are being stolen, you know, it is incumbent upon us to stem that flow of money. So the speed of which you conduct your investigations becomes important. And the third challenge that our investigators experience, and this is less of an investigative challenge and more of a manager, inspector general challenge, is, well, how do we pass on the lessons we've learned from our investigations? You know, how do we do this for our next generation of investigators who come in? And how do we, you know, teach what we learn to other agencies so that they can practice and draw from our best practices? And that's something that we call institutional memory. And so these are the 3 goals of our data analytics strategy, and is what really drove us down this path of developing an in-house data analytics team. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of what we do on a daily basis, I just want to give you a quick background of what we're dealing with here. So for the purposes of this discussion, we'll be talking about our experiences in 2 city agencies, the Human Resources Administration and the Department of Homeless Services, which last year actually was merged into one Department of Social Services. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'll keep them separate because they actually are operationally distinct. Now, the Human Resources Administration in New York City is the entity that administers public assistance, and that includes cash assistance, that includes what was formerly known as food stamps, which in the United States is now called SNAP. And Human Resources Administration also administers Medicaid, at least is one of the entities which administers Medicaid in the state of New York. Now, Human Resources Administration has about 14,000 employees, and they administer over $9.7 billion in benefits per year. So if you just look at the statistics and odds here, there's a high probability that you are going to have perhaps at least one corrupt individual amongst the 14,000 employees. So that's sort of the universe that we're playing with. What is unique about the Human Resources Administration also is that we, as an agency, as an oversight agency, have access somewhat to the public assistance data of the clients that the Human Resources Administration serves. And that is really the gold mine. And that, to a data analyst, is the perfect world. You know, you have millions and millions of records from which you can develop algorithms and test your theories on. So in a sense, you know, this was the perfect opportunity for us to devise a data analytics strategy using this wealth and really robust data set that we have available. So let me touch on the global view aspect of our first goal here in developing a data analytics strategy. So, you know, the investigators who are here in the audience that are practitioners, you know, value, I'm sure, the idea of having a global perspective, you know, on your issues and your investigations. The global view allows you to determine who the principal players are, you know, who are the co-conspirators, and it also allows you to determine the extent of the fraud. So the example that I gave to you previously is you know, essentially just a drop in a proverbial bucket here, because we have a lot of examples where complaints come in initially as innocuous client complaints, which we then develop through the use of data analytics into you know, uncovered large systemic schemes involving several individuals. So I'm going to turn this over to Calvin in a second. So the first example that we want to show you in use of data analytics involves a scheme that we took down back in December of 2015. It involved a fairly high-level HRA supervisor, and through her access to HRA records, she, through the course of about 18 months or so, stolen about $1.5 million along with her co-conspirators. And this was a very unique case. We had a name for it. It was called Red Bull, and the reason why we call it Red Bull was we found out through our investigations that it was partly a fencing scheme. So in other words, a lot of the food stamp monies that were stolen was then converted by fencing the products that were purchased by those food stamp benefits, and it was then fenced into local neighborhood stores. And in one instance, we found that one individual who was part of this fencing scheme, I think went through about $100,000 in about 4 months buying exclusively Red Bull. So I'm going to turn it over to Calvin. He's going to describe to you the data analytics that was used to uncover this scheme.
Hi, everyone. So the other side of this scheme, just to quickly finish it off, was the rental subsidy side. Specifically, a lot of the employee was issuing rent payments all to the same address, which turned out to be a single-family home. And I believe it was a couple $100,000 over there, too. So, so global view. It's important to first establish your control environment for the agency you're overseeing or for the investigation you're overseeing. How does the information flow? What data sets are actually available to you? And most importantly, how do you connect all these data points and data sets together to enhance your investigation? So for us, we started off with this investigation by analyzing the computer logs for all the clients that were receiving the complaint. We looked at all the employees that actually interacted with the clients and noticed that there were 6 common employees highlighted in red, in the red circles over there. And upon further investigation, we realized that there were similar computers used by these 6 clients. But there were still a lot of data points, and we needed to enhance it a little further. And that's when one of our investigators suggested using the payroll records, the city time records, in order to figure out when the employees clocked in. It was comparing these two together that we realized that only one employee was actually present when the computers were used to issue the benefits. So in essence, the other 5 user IDs were stolen, and a little more investigation turned out that that one user is a supervisor, all the other 5 employees. How else do we use the data records? In order for us to identify the recruiters, since they're not part of the employee system, we took a look at all the payments that were being issued out. We pull all the phone records for their office phone, for their cell phone, and on or around the time that the benefits were issued, we captured every phone call that occurred and compared to see which phone numbers were common. It was through that set and looking at the client records, we realized that one of the clients were actually acting as a recruiter and going out, grabbing EBT cards from other people and grabbing a whole bunch of EBT cards and going to the BJ's wholesale and running through maybe $10,000 at a time. And another, the way we identify the extent of the fraud, we take the computer logs then, we figure out all the payments that were issued for all the suspicious clients, and going back to the rent subsidies earlier, which payments actually matches that criteria that we discovered earlier. And for the ones that don't, we ignore, but we try to capture the entire history, not just the limited number of payments. So the next objective, speed. One of the things I think we all go through is that we have limited resources, especially manpower. And from my point of view, the data sets keep on getting bigger and bigger each year. We used to analyze maybe a couple of thousand financial records at a time. Now we're looking at millions upon millions. And how do you tackle that with limited resources, limited manpower? We use a lot of automation to handle this. So here's an example. One of the projects we handled was trying to figure out vehicle misuse by city employees. For our 2 agencies specifically, we started off with 136 vehicles for 1 year time span, which had 3.4 million GPS coordinates. So how do we tackle that? Where do we begin? We can manually go through. We can focus on specifically the outliers over here, the ones that travel far outside of New York City. And this is what we did, but we also automated the process. We use this as an example because we use Excel, coded in a couple of lines, and we capture everything that was inside New York City and only focus on the data points that are outside of New York City. When we did that, we were left with 38,000 data points and 7 vehicles. That significantly reduced the field of our investigators and what they actually had to look at. And when we aggregated the 38,000 data points, we're left with primarily 4 major vehicles to really investigate. And by aggregating it further, we see that they only travel outside of the city on certain days, and especially the second vehicle, vehicle number 423, we noticed that they primarily take the city vehicle on Saturdays and Sundays and maybe on Mondays. And using this methodology, we significantly reduce the time of what we have to look at, and we can actually produce, I guess, more viable reports in order for our investigators to dig a little further on, or just take this as the first initial run. For our third goal, and definitely our most important one, institutional memory. Our data sets are, like as we said earlier, the data sets are getting bigger and bigger. For our investigations, for each employee we investigate, if we were to look at the entirety of all the data points available for them, each employee handles between 2,000 and 6,000 cases a year. On average, each case has 3.5 years of activity, and each case may have, on average, 15 benefits per year. But this doesn't include all the applications, all the documents that get uploaded, all the computer activities that goes along with processing each particular data point. So for any case, on average, we're looking at maybe 50 million pieces, 50 million data points, or 50 million rows. What do we do to start targeting, just like the car data? And we learn from our past investigations. We take the knowledge from our past investigations, the schemes, codify it, and try to target the case numbers that are most suspicious based on past or previous history. So here's one example. Here's a history of the recertifications of one particular employee. Notice that this employee recertified at least 20 cases or 20 clients, 11 years or more. And upon further investigation, we realized that everyone in this bracket turned out to be a family member of this particular employee. So that becomes a that becomes a fraud indicator for us. So we take this, we take what we learned from the previous, from the Red Bow scheme, from employees using the same computers, and we form what we refer to as the dictionary of fraud. From going forward, each time we have a new case, we take the 50 million data points, we run it through our dictionary of fraud, and whatever cases are left over based on this are the ones we start to focus on. And this doesn't exclude the original allegation, which we still have to focus on too, but this gives us a good basis, and this gives us a good basis of where to focus our investigations.
And just to, extend Calvin's analysis here. So what we've described here, the three goals of data analytics here, the first was to obtain a global view. And what we've shown you here is perhaps something that, your investigative teams do on a daily basis. There's nothing special there. You're doing essentially what is known as a cross-data set analysis. You're taking, for example, phone records, and you're taking suspicious financial transactions, and you're combining the two and running simulations so that you can determine, for example, on a suspicious day, on a day of a suspicious transaction, who, if anybody, was making phone calls to, somebody else. So that's a very simple example of a cross-data set analysis. So there's nothing special about that. The second part, the speed, again, by itself, nothing uniquely special, but nonetheless crucial for you to implement a good data analytics strategy because, as Calvin mentioned, the number of records that we go through is extensive. And, to go through these records manually would take, as you can imagine, a very long time. And part of our strategy also was to determine what is the appropriate program, what is the appropriate environment from which we can run these simulations quickly. And as the car data example shows, we were dealing with millions of records here because we're looking at essentially city vehicle misuse. And with regard to that, each city vehicle most city vehicles in the city of New York have GPS devices. Maybe you didn't know that, but I'm telling you now. They have GPS devices, and that information is tracked in data points. So now, if you can imagine, we have at least 45 agencies, thousands of vehicles out there, and depending upon the period of time which you want to examine, you can imagine how vast that data set is. So, as one of our data analytics strategies is to make sure that we have a strategy in place to be able to crunch all those numbers and all those data sets in a short amount of time. The third point really is where I think, you'll find value in our proposition here, and that is institutional memory. That is the most critical part for us as an oversight agency, because in DOI's 144 years in existence, how can we leverage all those 144 years of experience? Well, one way that we can do that is if we codify our learnings in algorithms. Now, it's not going to be applicable to every situation, but in the realm of public assistance fraud, where data analytics is key, we learn from our past investigations. We've learned, for example, that in the case of Medicaid, serial renewals is an indicator of fraud. We've learned that expedited SNAP benefits given out on a continuous basis is an indicator of fraud. So it's one thing to have your investigator pass that along to, the new investigator. Is another thing for us to memorialize and codify that in an algorithm. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're codifying what we learned into an algorithm, into a dictionary of fraud indicators. Now, what's unique about this is that each fraud indicator is associated with a real case from which we've drawn that indicator. And that ensures a lot of things. Number one, it ensures that you have a frame of reference from which this indicator is drawing from. It's not something that is theoretical. It's been proven. And number two, you now have essentially a playbook of all your fraud indicators. And this playbook will exist long after Calvin and I will be gone. And so that's how we are really putting forth this idea of institutional memory. And I think that's really the most important part of having a data analytics strategy for oversight agencies. Now, I'll spend a few minutes of how we got here, essentially. So, we started this endeavor a few years ago, and our goals were finding a solution that would allow our investigators to have a global view of things, a solution that would allow us to conduct investigations in a reasonable amount of time, and a solution that will allow us to have institutional memory and to propagate our best practices. So how did we get here? Well, some of the challenges that we faced are described here. So the first challenge was determining, well, do we do an in-house data analytics team, or do we go for a prepackaged application, or is there something in between? So for those of you who've went through this process, I'm sure it's you and I probably share the same frustrations. We have our sales reps coming in, giving really glossy presentations. I'll throw out a few names. Palantir, SAS, they really host great events. But at the end of the day, you have to figure out what is best for you. Now, in our case, having a prepackaged application was not good for us, and I'll tell you why. Prepackaged applications, in our view, is good for perhaps the first two goals. So the goal of providing a global view, Palantir, SAS does that perfectly. The goal of speed, okay, we can find a specific network architecture that can do that from a prepackaged application. But the third goal of institutional memory, that's where the prepackaged application will not do, simply will not do for us. And so we were fortunate in terms of looking inside ourselves, and I was able to find Calvin here, who has been a DOI employee for quite some time, who does have a data analytics background, and he was able to really build up this team in-house. And this, for us, is the best solution. Now, you might not have a Calvin lurking amongst your midst. So, one of the solutions that might, be tenable to you is there are actually consultants out there that provide data analytics services. I would regard this more as a short-term solution. So in other words, you bring in a data analytics expert. This is a consultant who will be on your team and who will help you build the team. But eventually, and don't tell the consultants this, eventually the consultant will have to roll off, and you will have to be able to migrate that over to a permanent employee. And that, in my opinion, is how you're going to have that institutional memory, which I think is the most important aspect of this. So there are a couple of challenges here with the data and with statutory hurdles. Number one, I will tell you that with respect to the public assistance data, HRA does not own the data. It is state data. So you're going to have some limitations in terms of access. Number two, the statutory hurdles that we faced really concerns privacy. As you can imagine, public assistance data has certain restrictions in its use. So we can't just go in and run analytics without regard to any formal investigation. So you have to be mindful, when you start off on your data analytics adventure, of any statutory hurdles. Now, the fourth aspect of what is not really a challenge, but is something that is really key, that will help us with the other two challenges with the statutory hurdles and the data access, is interagency partnerships. Now, we have an excellent relationship with the Human Resources Administration. In fact, our data analytics group and their data analytics group work together. And so, with this combined, synergy, we are able to overcome some of the statutory hurdles, and as you can imagine, some of the data hurdles, because they are the primary agency that uses this data. We are not. So as long as they are our friends and our partners in this, we can continue on, this path of data analytics. Okay? And I think my time is up, but please, I hope we'll see many of you at our breakout sessions, and I'll be more than happy to discuss this in detail. Thank you.
I do want to respond on the consultant's behalf.
Yes, I know.
So I get brought into government agencies a lot as a consultant on data analytics, and anytime you hire an outside consultant for a project or an implementation, my advice would be to go with someone who actually helps implement solution into your organization's DNA. So any consultant who goes there and gives you a black box solution that nobody in your organization understands, and nobody can replicate the work after the fact, has not done the consulting project properly. So when I go in, I try to make sure that I work with the internal audit team or the IT team or all the key stakeholders in the organization to make sure that everybody understands the process and that they would be able to replicate the same analytics the next year, the year after that, or whenever there's a new incident. So it should be an iterative project and process, and not a one-time solution that only the consultant knows about. So I have, I think we are running out of time. Okay. I have one question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So, Milton, you already talked a little bit about the interagency data sharing, and I have been thinking about the interagency, but also interjurisdiction, because we have seen instances where a fraud scheme happens in one state or one city, and then because the data is not shared, the fraudsters are able to go to another jurisdiction and repeat the same thing. And we have seen instances where data sharing across organizations could have helped prevent fraud or corruption. I remember a case where the sole guardian of a child was arrested, but the child services wasn't informed by the New York police, so the child was in danger and ended up, being killed. But so I just want to ask about the general practices on data sharing, and so not just collaboration, but also because I know that there's privacy concerns, and this goes to all of you, because even in the instance with the business licenses, you could help inform the process by having information from other jurisdictions about business licensing fraud. So it really goes to all of you. If you could give me your thoughts about interagency, interorganization, but also interjurisdiction data sharing.
Well, I think it's important to forge those relationships, not just with that particular agency that you deal with on a daily basis, but rather if that agency has an oversight entity like the Human Resources Administration does here in New York City, it's incumbent upon us to forge a relationship with them. So for example, the way public assistance is structured is that the money comes from the federal government in the form of a block grant, and each state is allocated a particular amount of money to spend in public assistance. So in the state of New York, the state agency that handles this block allotment is the Office of Temporary Disability Administration, OTDA. And so OTDA actually has oversight of 50 or so social services districts in the state of New York. HRA happens to be one of those social services districts. It happens to be the biggest, but it is nonetheless one of those social services districts. So what happens is you have several layers of oversight, and the true owner of that data is actually the state of New York. So in terms of cross-jurisdiction sharing of data, if you have a good relationship, I mean, it's easier said than done, but what I've experienced is that our good relationship with HRA also extends to OTDA. And when it comes time for us to, for example, we had a case where we had to share information with the state of Massachusetts, it was not us who made that phone call, but rather our friends at OTDA as a state entity would then, reach out to their neighboring state agency for that discussion to happen. So I think the key to this cross-jurisdictional sharing of data is developing those good working relationships between the agencies involved.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any experience with
Yeah,
cross-jurisdiction sharing?
I totally agree with that separation of the technical challenge and what would be the relationship or the political challenge on that. So first thing will be to understand who are the players in each agency or level of government. And through our project, at the beginning we have a lot of difficulty, but we got a governmental change and a lot of doors open for us. And the second phase of our project was very interesting, that we were able to find common goals with other agencies' representatives. So I think you have really to put a lot of effort on finding common goals, building committees, and trying to find how to act together with those representatives. And after that, you go into details: who wants the data, who will copy the data, who will have access to the data. This is all technical, and many times technical aspects bump into in front of political ones as if they were the main thing, and normally they are not. So just to add that.
And just to add on to that, I think that the idea of data sharing is a wonderful one, but in practice, the relationship is utmost important, because the data that we're dealing with, in this case, public assistance, each state has their own privacy statutes surrounding it. So even though I think all officials would agree that, sharing data across jurisdiction is a great idea, you run into what is one of the challenges that we discussed, and that is the statutory challenges.
I think we can maybe take one question or a couple from the floor. Yes?
My question is for Mr. Yu. We have a lot of wonderful young people in New York City without employment. And I'm just wondering, what are the credentials to begin to be an investigator with your department? And what kind of a person do you feel succeeds in your department?
That's a wonderful question, and this is something that I wanted to discuss a little bit about, at least with just choosing your data analytics team, but it certainly holds true for investigators. Look, when we looked for a data analyst, and this goes for investigators too, we look for creative individuals. And so with respect to our analysts in particular, now you would probably think that, Calvin has a computer science background, or our data analysts all come from computer, and you'd be furthest thing from the truth. Some of our data scientists in the past held PhDs in molecular biology. The data scientists we deal with on a daily basis at HRA also have PhDs in atmospheric science, epidemiology. Some of the analysts that I've worked with in my previous employment, the best ones were writers. One of them was a poet. So be flexible. What you really want to look for is somebody who is creative, who's driven, and who's used to the rigors of investigation, and that also applies for data analysis as well. And you can't go wrong.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes, go ahead.
What about false negatives? How do you leave that to investigators on the ground to check out if it's a red flag, or do you have any system for saying this is probably an anomaly
Sure.
which doesn't indicate fraud?
Right, and it goes back to our partnerships with our agencies. Now, we are by no means public assistance experts, but HRA is. And so when we find things that look suspicious to us and we're not quite sure what that means, we refer and work with our partners at HRA who are the public assistance experts, who have seen public assistance fraud, and we consult with them. And that's how we sort of ferret out the false negatives, as you said.
Did you want to add to that, or? Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you match up that institutional memory in the computer bank with that 30-year field investigator, who immediately looks at that map and says, oh, I know what, that's a hunting farm up there. Just because he's been there, he's seen it, and it's kind of a hard balance, isn't it?
Well, it's not really, and I'll tell you why. And this is why, you know, our decision to have a separate data analytics team as opposed to outfitting our investigators with the tool was a crucial distinction. Our investigators do investigations well. That's their goal. What they learn will then be translated by the data analyst, you know, into the algorithms and into that institutional knowledge. So, in other words, the job, one of the many jobs of the data analytics team is taking the knowledge of that investigator and trying to somehow codify it into an algorithm. And sometimes it doesn't occur. You know, it's harder than I make it out to be. But nonetheless, you know, hopefully that the 30 years worth of experience that an investigator had, if we can tap into even 10 years of that and memorialize that, we're ahead of the game.
Yeah, one more over there.
This question is for Bruno. We have done something similar in Bogota about license and the processes in the how to make them efficient, etc. But I would like to ask if you have any information about costs. How much does it cost to put in place the system, the new one, and the savings? Because that's a very good argument to convince public officials to get into something like that.
So we had support from some development agencies. Also, we had support from Bloomberg Associates here to design and implement the projects. So this was some costs that were not from the government. I mean, it was their own agencies' costs, the development agency and here Bloomberg Associate institution. But the cost there in terms of money to put that in place was so little in terms of what we got back that we did a study on that, but it was like thousands % in advantage. Like the cost of putting those projects together and this change was less than, I would say, $1 million in terms of reals. That would be like $300,000, $400,000. So in terms of benefits, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars that during the years will not be expanded even by companies or by the government, or will apply to public servants in other features or in other tasks. So we had that study, but the figures are so high that I don't even consider that like a barrier to implement in other places. With much more difficulties to overcome political challenges and cultural barriers. So that's why usually I think that external agents can help a lot in Latin American countries to put some pressure on what has to be done.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's it. And our next session is starting in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So
well, let's take a break. Let's start at promptly at 11:20. Let's take a break until then, and let's thank our first panel.